Thank you for tuning into The Global Novel. I'm Claire Hennessy. Translation studies is an academic interdiscipline dealing with the systematic study of the theory, description, and application of translation, interpreting, and localization. After I talked with Tierry Groensteen, whose work on comic theory was translated and introduced to the Anglophone world by Bart, Beaty, and Nguyen, today I speak with these two translators who will share with us their experience and insights of translating theory. Hello, Bart and Nick. Could you please introduce yourselves?
My name is Bart Beaty, and I am a professor in the Department of English at the University of Calgary in Canada.
Hello, my name is Nick Nguyen. I am an archivist at an international organization that's situated in Brussels, Belgium.
Great to have both of you on the show. First of all, where can we situate the Franco-Belgian school of visual semiotics within the continental philosophical tradition? And where can we place Groensteen in the Franco-Belgian school of this field?
I think understanding the origins of the study of comics in the Franco-Belgian tradition really comes out of a combination of two forces that overlap. So there is the semiotic tradition on the one hand, where we can think of Roland Bart or Umberto Eco as important forerunners, but also sort of paradoxically a fan-driven phenomenon, where in the 1960s we began to see highly educated comic book fans organizing knowledge for the first time in non-academic sectors, but in ways that echoed in some ways the traditions of academic scholarship. So we begin to see the first organizations of exhibitions of comics art. We begin to see fan historians coming together to develop publishing histories, checklists of important works, and so on. And these organizations kind of loosely based around Paris in the 1960s, begin to publish fanzines, fan magazines, organize symposia, organize workshops, and so on, and begin the struggle to understand the formal elements of comics in a way that really echoes the work that was being done in film studies. Comic studies in France and Belgium, I think, owes a lot to the experience of film studies from a decade prior. And so if we think, and if your listeners think, for instance, of the development of writing, of academic writing on film, comes out of the Cinematheque and filmmakers like Godard and Truffaut and so on, who become the kind of professionals who are tied into and lead the way in some ways for the academics. The same thing happens on the comics side. Groensteen arrives much later than that, so he's not someone who's involved in the 1960s, but he comes out of that same tradition. So he was the editor of Cahiers de la Bande Dessinée, which was a non-academic magazine about writing about comics, had criticism, had interviews with important artists and so on. But under his leadership really became more and more nuanced and sophisticated and analytic, and started to take on bigger and bigger questions surrounding the role and operation of comics. And so as he and his colleagues at that magazine started to explore these questions, I think it was a natural inclination of his to drive it further and further to the point that he decided to do his dissertation in this area. But by the time he started writing what became a system of comics, there were a couple of decades worth of fanish and semi-professional semiotic analysis in France and Belgium for him to draw on and respond to.
In terms of echoes, Groensteen comes along at a specific moment, let's say in history and in time, where he's following, this lead. And again, his first monograph comes along in 1980, and he actually he organizes a major comic symposium in 1987. which gathers one of the first kind of large, gatherings of both cartoonists and theoreticians and practitioners. And if I'm not mistaken, Système de la bande dessinée is also his dissertation as well that he submits in the late 90s, which then becomes published in 99 as Système de la bande dessinée.
Mm-hmm. Well, Groensteen's work is deemed as groundbreaking in terms of the operation of the language of comics, and I believe so is its translation. So could you please talk about what this translation means for the Anglophone world of comic studies?
I looked it up just the other day to see how widely this work had been taken up, because you always get your own impressionistic sense. And I noted that it had more than 1,300 citations at this point, which is really gratifying. I think the book really came out at a time when, in the English speaking and reading world, the major formalist work on comics was Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. And Understanding Comics is a fascinating book. It is used as a kind of introductory textbook in many, many, many introductory comics classes at universities around the world. But it has a lot of limitations. I've used it as a textbook dozens of times in my own courses. And I find with that book, you constantly introduce students to these ideas. And then you say, well, hold on, there are these reservations that we might have about it. Because McCloud is not an academic. He is a cartoonist himself. He's an autodidact. And so it's an interesting book, but with limitations. Groensteen's book was really received in some ways as a rejoinder to McCloud, even though I don't think in any way he set out to write it that way. McCloud isn't that discussed in the book, but it became sort of the second dense theoretical work on comics form. And so people who were attracted to writing on that topic were going to cite one or the other or both of those works. And so some of his ideas, I think, have really moved into the mainstream of comics study, partly because for about a decade, the study of comics form was probably the driving issue in comic studies. That is, that scholars were trying to create a language that would separate comic studies from other fields like literary studies or film studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too, the point about McCloud and the timing. If I remember correctly, McCloud is 95. Prior to that, one of the main textbooks was again by another artist, Will Eisner. So that pretty much dominated a lot of the terms that that were circulating. And again, before even comic studies becomes an actual thing, as an accredited field of discipline in the North American university system. I mean, at most, if I remember correctly, and Bart, please correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of comics work being done at the academic level at that time was coming out of English departments. So finding useful vocabulary, specific academic, if you want to call it vocabulary or jargon, is pretty nascent at this moment in time. So the timing, again, I'm all about the timing of of Groensteen's book, arriving in a French context, and then finally, and I think that was part of the reasons why it was selected for translation. It's like, hey, now's as good a time as any, as things are starting to grow, that we can start offering alternative, European continental perspectives on this growing field.
I would just add to what Nick has said. That he's absolutely right that there's been the dominance in comic studies in the North American context, that the work comes out of literature departments, whether English lit or comp lit or French language programs and so on. And that meant initially that a lot of the early scholarship, it would talk about thematic elements and so on that are very familiar to scholars in literature departments. But a lot of those scholars did lack a specific terminology and lens through which to read the visual elements. And so I think Groensteen's analysis of visual elements, his consideration of the page as the basis of meaning, the way that he talks about braiding and weaving across time and through works and so on, ideas like mise en page become very important to English, to people trained in English that might have lacked the background in art history, but still need to talk about the visual elements of an art form that is primarily visual.
Mm-hmm. How did you guys find his thesis, his dissertation? What inspired you to translate his work? And when was that initial recognition that, wow, this is a brilliant work and it's going to bring so much impact on the world of comics and that it needs to be translated into English immediately?
Yeah, I had met Tierry Groensteen, probably dozens of times before I'd done the work. I think the first time I would have met him would have been at the ICAF conference, which in the 90s was the only kind of dedicated scholarly conference about comics held every year in North America. And Thierry was brought over in the late, I want to say about 97 to Washington, D.C. to give one of the keynote addresses. And I remember he was there with the cartoonist Claire Bretéché as an international guest of honor. I remember sitting on the back of a bus as we were being taken somewhere to go and see an exhibition somewhere in Washington, and to a couple of the events at that conference. So I'd known him for quite some time, and I would see him every year at the Anglophone Comics Festival at the end of January. Every year, the largest comics festival held in France. So we were acquaintances. I was aware of his work. I remember buying his book when it came out and reading it with interest, and then being asked by the University Press of Mississippi whether or not I thought it should be translated. So it was submitted to them. They thought, okay, they asked me to do a referee's report on the published book, which is a bit odd. Normally you do this on a manuscript, and you would suggest revisions. And in this case, it really wouldn't be suggesting revisions. It's just giving a yes or no. I think this is an important work to be translated. And of course, I said yes. It is an important work, and I thought it would be of great interest to readers in North America and the English-speaking world, and I said so. And then some time passed, and I said, okay, well, we're going to do this book, but the person that they had hired to do the translation dropped out of the project. He felt that it was going to take too long and wasn't going to pay enough money, and so there was just wasn't going to be remunerative for him. And did I know anybody else who would like to do it, or might I like to do it myself? And I thought about it for a while and said, well, that'd be an interesting project. I had lived in Montreal, and my French was pretty good, but I'd moved to Calgary where no one speaks French, and I felt like my French was atrophying a bit. I thought, well, okay, this would be a good way to kind of test myself. But I was also confident that I didn't want to do the work myself. And so I suggested that Nick come in, that his French was stronger than mine, and that we might divide the work and do it that way.
Right. So actually, I just want to rewind a bit, because to add to what Bart was saying, just in case some of your readers don't know what the acronym ICAF means, the International Comic and Arts Forum, right? Bart, Forum, right?
Yeah, it started as festival, and then changed its name to a forum somewhere around 2000, I think.
Yeah. So this was a major, let's say, exchange, especially between American academics and European artists, especially. There was a lot of crossover happening. And if I'm not mistaken, Bart, it was Guy Spielman at head of the French department at Georgetown. That was one of the key drivers behind that. This conference, if you want to call it. And so it was there that exchange too. That I, for myself, when I started to go with Bart, actually. It became my first encounter with this kind of academic exchange, right? And so again, part of it is the timing, right? Again, this is late 90s, right? There's this kind of acceleration and progression towards an interest in what's going on in Europe right now. And again, coming out at the same time as, with MacLeod's book, starting a discussion about, hey, let's talk about comics in a certain kind of way, and what's going on in Europe, and how are they talking about it in a certain kind of way? a focus on form, the beginning of, academic interest and dissertations about comics form starting to come along. And so I think this kind of perfect storm of events basically allows, again, brings the interest for Thierry's book to come out as as a continental alternative to MacLeod's dominant text at the time. And at the time when MacLeod's book came out, it was, I remember when I first read it, I was just like, it was quite visionary for me, because it was the first time I'd actually, here's an engagement trying to speak to it about comics on its own terms by someone who practices. But now, along comes, here's this alternative version coming from a very different tradition, using very specific language to draw in another crowd, right? And that was the challenge. And that was the interest for me. It was just like, okay, now, I'd like to become engaged in this process, especially of this cross-cultural exchange, right? And that's a lot of what that's a lot about my own academic interests as well, especially the Franco-American exchange with respect to cinema and comics. So when Bart asked me to join in on this project, I was thrilled to do so, because it became my way to participate into this larger discussion.
There's the one other thing I would mention is because Nick is really, I think, correctly emphasizing the timing of all this. It's not just that ICAF existed at that time, although that was incredibly important, but it was also that the University Press of Mississippi had decided, under the directorship of Sita Srinivasan, to invest in the area of comic studies. And so they were really the one press in North America that was interested in this area. So comic studies has existed in the English-speaking world, only around a few scholars, Don Alt, David Kunzel, Tom Inge. And Tom Inge convinced the University Press of Mississippi to start publishing work on comics, including Joseph Wittig's book in 1989. And then in the early 2000s, late 90s and early 2000s, started to move more and more in that direction. They published Charles Hatfield's book. They published my book, for example. And those books were successful for them. And so they decided that they wanted to try and corner the market on comic studies. And this was very much them reaching out and saying, okay, maybe we should start translating these books. It will help us build this line even more forcefully. And while many presses have now started publishing work in comic studies, Mississippi is still sort of the flagship publisher, even though they've changed editors over time. And so Sita left, and we ended up working with Walter Biggins on this. But the press was always tremendously supportive of this kind of work in a way that many other university presses, I think, would have been reluctant to take on this work. I remember even in the kind of mid-2000s, some of the, bigger flagship state university presses, University of California Press and so on, were skeptical of work in comic studies. And so I think without Sita's foresight and Walter's commitment to the area as well, comic studies would not be in the place that it is today.
Wow. What an inspiring experience. So what are at stake for such an ambitious project at the level of syntactical, semantic, ideological, or even beyond?
I think there's, Nick and I were discussing this the other day, trying to, look back now a decade and a half later and think through exactly what is the kind of major accomplishments of this book. And I think so much of it is at the level of opening up formal analysis to new ways of understanding that. Groensteen came to the study of comics with a tremendous understanding of semiotics, the history of semiotics, semiotic theory, and so on, but also a ridiculous knowledge of the state of comics publishing at the time. And just looking at the book again, his examples are always so wide-ranging and so well chosen. And I think some of them are even lost on English language readers because he's referencing books that have had tremendous influence in Europe and never been translated in the United States. And so they lose occasionally the sense of how strong his choices are. But he has, a kind of authorial understanding of the way comics work. He himself has been a comics publisher. He is a comics creator. He's written scripts for comics.
We hope you have enjoyed the episode so far. If you want to hear the entire episode, you can subscribe at theglobalnovel.com/subscribe. Thank you so much for listening.